Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our session. My name is Emily Keys, and I'm joined today by Skylee-Storm Hogan. To open our session, Skylee, could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Emily. My name is Skylee-Storm. I work for No History Historical Services, and I am the co-producer and writer of the film that you just saw, Bridging the Past. I am originally from the Mohawk Nation of Ganawage, my father's community. I have grown up in the GTA, and I currently live and work on the Algonquin and Anishinaabe conceded territory of what is now known as Ottawa.
And my name is Emily. I have the pleasure of working with Skylee at No History. No History is a historical services company. And similar to Skylee, I am calling in today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So to sort of get us started in our discussion, Skylee, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about this project, how it sort of came about, and how you became interested in doing a documentary.
Awesome. Well, I am the first recipient of No History's Public History Scholarship, which with my program at the University of Western Ontario's Public History MA program, I applied for a internship of 6 months with No History to work in their Ottawa-based office. And as part of that internship, I was going to design and research my own project. I'd never tried documentary filmmaking before, and it wasn't my initial thought, but under the guidance of our directors, I kind of saw how it could be an interesting medium to express what I wanted to research. And I was in the process of kind of reconnecting and visiting with my father's community because now I lived so much closer to Ganawage that I decided to integrate my project with that community just because it was something that I wanted to do. I wanted to get closer to the history and to the narrative of my family's place within that community. So I initially started looking at ironwork because my grandfather and my great grandfather and his father before him were all ironworkers. And it's a legacy that still really lives on in the community. A lot of people are ironworkers or tradespeople. And it's something that really defined us as a community for a little while. It just like really demonstrated our ability to be careful, our physical abilities, our bravery, our really our resilience in creating massive structures across the world.
And you mentioned that sort of through this project and while you were starting this project, you were starting the process of sort of reconnecting with your heritage. Had you ever visited the community before starting the project?
Yes, I had actually. I've been visiting for the last few years. My father was in a position where he couldn't be in the community, but he'd returned to live there a couple of years prior to me starting the project. And I had decided to start visiting. It was probably a year or two after I'd initially gone to the community again, like after a while, when I started thinking like, I'd like to be here more. So I really would like to do a project that's integrated with the community so I can feel a little bit more a part of it.
And on those early visits, had you visited the memorial that's shown and discussed in the documentary, or were you aware of sort of the history and your family's connection to the memorial and to the bridge specifically?
Yeah, my Uncle Billy is actually in long-term care in the community. And so my Aunt Joanne, his daughter, had taken me to the family home and we had gone through a lot of photographs and different things. And I saw my father's grandfather in New York, standing on some steel beam structures and like all done up, like with the hard hat and like the coveralls and the welding torch. And it was something I knew that our family was involved in. And I had been to the memorial, not like formally. I'd taken a look at it and kind of walked by it because it's in a park that runs along the St. Lawrence River. So it's just kind of a general area where a lot of people like to go for walks or like strolls. It's near the old swimming place that my Aunt Joanne used to go to as a kid. So it was somewhere we stopped along what she calls the grand tour of town. So I got to see it before then. Also, too, at 2 points of the community, kind of what the old boundaries used to be, there are two steel crosses, and those were actually put up in memorial of those men, but not a lot of people know that. They just kind of thought it was our history of Catholicism or like our missionary history, and then combined with ironwork. But those beams were actually donated, and that was something I found out during the research for this film.
And so, how aware were you of the history of the bridge collapse, sort of specifically, before starting that project? And you mentioned your family's history with ironwork. What was it about that event specifically that you decided to focus on versus, maybe a sort of a broader approach to that history in the community?
Well, I was looking initially at our family's history in New York. There's a neighborhood in Brooklyn that used to be known as Little Gognawaga, which was about a 3 to 5 block radius where people who worked in ironwork trade from Ganawaga would specifically go and live. There's a really great NFB, National Film Board of Canada film about Little Gognawaga, specifically how the women brought it together. And I watched that film and I saw the memorial. I saw the 100-year commemoration for the Quebec Bridge disaster. And so my wanting to do research about New York, which had been already heavily done, kind of led me to Little Gognawaga, which had been already done about 10 years prior. And then it led me to the Quebec Bridge disaster, which I didn't find too much about. And it made me realize too that we wouldn't have boomed out or like had spread across Canada and the United States if it hadn't been for the Quebec Bridge disaster. Because up until that point, large gangs of men, well, they call them worker gangs. So like it doesn't have the same connotation as it does now. But these groups of men would leave Ganawaga together, sometimes as many as like 30-40 people, to go work a single job for a bridge company or for a railway or to build a building. And, the bridge disaster was the first time that something bad had really happened, and most of those men had died. And the women of the community, who were the leaders of the community, really felt that, losing this many men at a time is a serious issue because you're leaving behind widows. And in the context of the Indian Act, women didn't have a lot of rights back then. They couldn't inherit property without a husband or a father or an uncle kind of taking guardianship over that for them. And it left a lot of children without a breadwinner, etc. And they felt like, well, now you're going to have to spread out in groups of 5 or 10 and go to different build sites. And that's what led to the boom out. So I thought to myself, like, this was a really big dramatic event for the community. They built a memorial, but not a lot of people talk about it. And a lot of people are still not really talking about it because it was something that really deeply hurt many of the families. However, it was something that really connected all of the families. It was something that had touched nearly every family in the community. And it was something that really changed the way that we did ironwork, which led to our heavy presence in New York and northern United States.
Something that isn't sort of spoken about in the film, and that I would only know about because I remember you were setting off on some of the interviews during this time. But can you speak a little bit about filming and that process of doing those community visits and that community engagement at the start, really, of the COVID pandemic, as well as some of the blockades that were happening at the same time?
Yeah, for sure. So because I hadn't lived regularly in the community growing up, a lot of the work that I had to do was talking to my aunt and my uncle, and even to my dad to some extent, my cousins, and trying to figure out, like, who would be the good person to talk to. And luckily, my family lives close to the cultural center, so that was my first stop. And I spoke to the lead of the cultural center at that time, Tommy Deere, who is an amazing graphic artist and a, a language teacher. And he's very, like, he's fluent in our language, which is a rarity in our community. And he pointed me in the direction of his mother-in-law, who actually was a part of the committee that built the memorial. So that was perfect. And then I met her, and then I had to explain to her who all my family members were. And my uncle Billy actually painted a portrait that was in her living room. And I found out that her first cousin is actually like my second cousin or something like that. So we were actually related somehow. So that was a lot of the work that I had to do, was kind of introducing myself and making sure that I understood myself in relation to the community. Just because that's really how a lot of these First Nations communities work in Canada is, they're a small community. Ours isn't that small. Ours is quite large, but at the same time, if you are from the community and you know how you connect to other people, people will be able to recognize you, open up to you, talk to you. And that was a lot of like relationship building and hard work. I still talk to them regularly. I send them email updates, let them know how everything's going, check in with them, especially during the pandemic, as you said. So I actually went in about 2 weeks before 2 weeks before the countrywide lockdown in Canada. At that time, there was solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en resistance going on in response to the pipeline construction happening in British Columbia. And my community had closed off a section of railway that passed through our community. And they also were doing a demonstration on the Mercier Bridge, which connects us to main Montreal. And there was some concern at the time in the community that the police force of Quebec, the SQ, Sécurité Quebec, was going to block off the bridge. And even for the people that I was interviewing, there was a lot of anxiety. Our interviews were getting interrupted because they were getting phone calls and people were giving them information from the line of the resistance to them. And they were worried about their grandkids who were going to school in Montreal off reserve. And they were worried about them getting back into the community if the bridge got closed. And a lot of memories of the 1990-1991 Oka resistance were coming up, which for them was a very traumatic time because they had to be armed. They were dealing with violence not only from the police, but from the surrounding Quebecois residents. And they were worried that it would escalate and that it would get back to that again. And they were worried about the police coming into the community because the last time that happened, things didn't go so well for a lot of people. And kind of being patient and understanding that this is a very serious situation and we need to be respectful. And, I had two full days of filming planned, but we had to try to do as much as we can. So three of my interviews couldn't come because one was stuck in Montreal and she couldn't get across the bridge. She just taught a course over at McGill. Another woman, she just had a death in the family happen the day before and wasn't able to come. And then the third, he was actually at the resistance at the railway line because he's a cultural leader in our community and he wasn't able to come. So Kathy and David still graciously accepted and had me interview them, and we did talking. And honestly, it was so long. It was like 6 hours of talking and asking questions and getting footage, and then getting B-roll around the house and kind of doing all of that extra stuff, which nobody tells you about B-roll when you go in to make a movie. It takes up a lot of time. And then after we were done our interviews, we were driving around the community, myself and the videographer, doing some extra B-roll shots. And we were thinking to ourselves, like, I don't know if we should stay here tonight, because if we stay here tonight, we might not be able to get home tomorrow. And he had to fly out to BC the next day. And I was just like, yeah, like, I also don't want to intrude during a very sensitive time, like with cameras and stuff, because even as we were filming B-roll in the community, people were slowing down with their cars and being like, hey, what are you doing? And then I would just say, like, hey, I'm this person, my dad's this person. I'm filming like a historical video about the Quebec Bridge. And then everyone's just like, oh, okay. Because people were worried that I was a reporter. So just being really cognizant of that and just saying to myself, well, you know what, maybe right now isn't the best time to do it. I'll come back. So I went home and I was planning to come back. And then not even 2 weeks later, it was like, well, it's March and we're shutting everything down. And COVID-19, and my dad's community, like Ganawagi, completely shut people out because they wanted to control the situation. We have a lot of elders. We have a hospital, which is very fortunate and somewhat uncommon for communities, but they really wanted to make sure they contained it and had a lid on it. So out of respect, I hadn't gone back to the community to finish up any of that work, and I just decided to make something shorter and work with what we have. So a lot of things happened at once, and it kind of changed the course of what we ended up with.
Both in the film and in some of our discussion, you sort of talked about, and there have been there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the importance of relationships as part in this project, and being able to to do that research and sort of situate yourself within the community and that research. Has that experience sort of influenced you, do you think, in terms of how you'll approach some other any kind of future project where that mindset of being aware of where you sort of fit into that community?
Yeah, for sure. I know that I've talked with other folks about projects, like, because now they kind of know what I do and they have a better understanding of what we do, especially after No History's launch of No Indigenous History. I've gotten a lot of questions from people that I know personally who are like in leadership positions within First Nations in different parts of Canada. I was very fortunate where I did my undergraduate degree at a university in Northern Ontario that had a very high Indigenous population. And I ended up meeting with and working with a lot of people who would become leaders in their First Nation communities. So when I approach projects, especially in that region, I situate myself within that region. Like, I am Mohawk in background. However, I do have kinship ties to Missinaba Cree First Nation, to Batchewana First Nation. And, I kind of explain how that is and how that came about, as well as I explain how I know certain individuals within their community. And I usually approach those individuals first before talking to other community members, just to kind of ask, like, is there anything that I should be doing, or like a best practice, or like, should I even be doing this? Because, you can be from a specific Indigenous community, but your knowledge and your customs are really specific to that Indigenous community, and you don't automatically then speak for everyone or understands, because Cree and Mohawk, Ganyagahaga communities are completely different. Even within ourselves, we're a confederacy, and there's different dialects within that confederacy, and different ways that we spell and write our words in Mohawk. It's not all the same. So it's being able to understand, is it okay for me to approach this with the way that I'm approaching it? Fortunately, the way that we do work is, as you know, we work with our partners, and we really do things the way that those people want those things done, and we take our direction from those communities. And that was the way that I did work when I was in Northern Ontario going to university there, because I worked for a residential school survivor driven institution where we took all of our cues and all of our direction from the survivor and descendant communities. And that kind of got me used to it, where it's like there's going to be moments where I don't know what to do because I'm not a Ojibwe, I'm not an Anishinaabe, this isn't my wheelhouse. So I'm going to have to defer to somebody else's best judgment or speak to an elder who's familiar with this. But yeah, it's changed the way I approach things, definitely, because sometimes you get offended if people will say, "Who are you?" And that's happened a lot recently, with like creators and people who don't live in their communities. Is people will ask, well, like, who are you? And that's not to be rude. It's honestly, that's the way that Indigenous people, in my experience, introduce themselves. Is they usually say what their name is, what community they're from, and then in some cases who their relatives are in that community. And that's okay. That's just people trying to understand your relationship to your land and your relationship to them potentially. So that's kind of what happened. Is it really changed my perspective, especially with working with other communities. Is like explaining exactly where I'm coming from, why I'm doing something, and how I'm connected to this. And understanding that that's just a vital part of relationship building.
And for those of you who are interested, at the end, we can share the link to both the documentary, if you haven't seen it yet, as well as No Indigenous History to learn a little bit more about it. What's something that we've talked a lot about what you've sort of learned and taken away from this project. What's something that you learned through the project that didn't unfortunately make it into the documentary?
Well, during the documentary, when I started out, I didn't expect to be directly related to someone who died that day on the Quebec Bridge, and finding out too that it was my grandfather's great grandfather, so my 3 times great grandfather, who died, and kind of learning from my aunts and talking to her about things that have happened in our family's history, and then realizing that some of those things are connected to that death. That some of the losses that we had later on and some of the issues that we had later on were because of that sudden unexpected death. And it's interesting how that reverberates throughout generations. We had a sizable piece of property at one point that was inherited through his daughter, who is my great grandmother, and her and my great grandfather had lost that property afterwards because there were some issues there, and when Thomas Jacques was no longer there to help out with it and help manage it, it didn't end up very well, and we ended up losing that property. And my family ended up living somewhere closer to like the downtown. I don't know how that property was inherited, but then we ended up losing that as well, or moving to like a different part of the community. But it was interesting to kind of see how those connections developed. Also, too, I know I mentioned at the end of the film that it's a story that connected me to another Mohawk community of Tyendinaga, which is closer to the Ottawa area. It was interesting because Thomas Jacques' wife was from Tyendinaga. Her marriage record said Desaronto, but after doing some some digging, I found out that she wasn't a legitimate child, so there wasn't a lot of good records. But her and her mother came from the Tyendinaga Mohawk community, and she's actually buried in Tyendinaga. And my aunt Joanne had a photo of my uncle Sonny standing beside her grave, and it said like Lydia Jacques, and then also in memory of Thomas, who was the man who died on the bridge. And she said it was so weird. I never understood why we had a relative in Tyendinaga, but then I asked her before she even told me that or showed me the photo, like, are we related to people in Tyendinaga? And she was like, yeah. And it was just one of those moments where like the research connected with a knowledge or a history that my family had that I wasn't made aware of yet. And it kind of showed me like the power of being able to utilize those research skills or like the public history knowledge that I have. A couple other really cool things happened that didn't make it into the documentary was that David Rice was actually one of the people who built the World Trade Center. And and he was actually there on September 11th when the Trade Center was hit, and he watched it happen. And that was a really powerful and very interesting story. And two, with what was going on that day with the blockades and the threat of police occupation, I was getting a lot of these stories from both Kathy and David of their experiences in the Oka crisis. Getting stories from my Aunt Joanne and my Uncle Charlie about their experiences with the Oka crisis. And even some stories from my dad when I got home. It was just like, there were all these just like, they'd sit there quietly for a minute and then they'd tell me this story, which is incredibly shocking. And I would just be like, oh my God, like just this thing is bringing up all of those memories that like they don't regularly talk about. And it was something that kind of inspired me to do further recsearch and make more connections within the community to be like, hey, we should talk about these stories and start recording those. So hopefully that's going to happen in the future.
I hope so too. What is something that you hope viewers take away from the film?
I hope that viewers can take away that sometimes when you do research or sometimes when you're drawn to something, like as a historian or as a public historian, that sometimes, you know, you're going to be connected to it in a small way, or it's going to fill in gaps of the story that's bigger than the thing itself. For wider Canadians or even like our American neighbors, you know, it's really looking at the fact that Indigenous people, Native Americans, as they're called in the United States, are really not just tied to these traditional ideas of, you know, they live on their reserves or they lived in a certain way of life and that way of life is gone now. You know, Mohawk people adapted, they changed. Same thing with Indigenous people all across Turtle Island is they adapted and changed, and they found new and better ways of doing things within the circumstances that they were given. And, you know, when I'm in an urban place, like a big city, like in Quebec or in Ottawa, or even in the United States, if I'm traveling, you know, when I see big skyscrapers and I see big bridges and I see, you know, railway tracks and like all of that stuff, I don't feel disconnected from that. That's actually like something to me that's built into what my identity is. When I think about, you know, large urban sprawl, I think about the fact that, you know, like my ancestors were involved in building a lot of that. And it's funny, even when I was living in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, attending university, like my undergrad, the bridge there that connected Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, Mohawks helped build that bridge. So like we were all over North America, all over the central and south United States building things. And we were a part of the land in a different way. So while, you know, non-Indigenous people don't see Indigenous people reflected in their urban landscapes, we see ourselves reflected in those landscapes. And that's just something that I've been trying to push and get people to take away from my work is that, you know, we are here. We are in these spaces that, you know, that people don't think that we're in. And it's just something to think about.
And maybe it's worth adding, I'm not sure where viewers will be picking this up in terms of their conference programming, but I don't know if you want to share a little bit about how that ties into the other sort of session that you'll be speaking about at the NCPH this year.
Yeah, for sure. So I have another session called Stories, Values, and Access, where I'll be talking a little bit about how a lot of grants, a lot of writing opportunities, a lot of documentary opportunities, and otherwise, they really focus on traditional reclamation or reclaiming historical practices for Indigenous people and communities. However, we have this long, over 100-year legacy of living away from our communities and being relocated. Even the reserves that we live on are not our traditional territories, and there's all these urban Indigenous narratives and urban Indigenous stories of resistance. So urban Indigenous meaning, you know, people who are Indigenous who live in urban settings or just like where cities are with settlers. And, you know, there's all these things that they've done and been a part of, and all of the legacies that have been set for today, even more contemporary stories of Indigenous peoples, like with the Two Spirit movement, with Mani Chakabe, who's an elder in Thunder Bay. And, you know, when you talk about those things, settler historians are often uninterested. They want to know the traditional stuff. They really want, like, you know, the vanishing Indian narrative, or like they want you to reclaim your culture and like all this stuff, without realizing that culture is something that's very fluid and living. It's not static. And, you know, there's this vibrant urban Indigenous culture that exists in Canada and the United States. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about in that session is talking about, you know, like these things exist, but it's also reflecting as well on what has happened with COVID-19 and the fact that, you know, a lot of our records are controlled by government organizations who have shut down because of COVID-19. So we can't actually access our own records. And it's very problematic and very difficult to do that history work for Indigenous people right now, just because we don't have possession of those things.
It's going to be a great session.
Looking forward to it.
Just before we sort of wrap up our sort of official question and answer portion, I just wanted to give you the opportunity if there was anything else that you wanted to share that we might not have gotten the chance to cover.
No, like I think that this was a really great Q&A to kind of explore some of the things that happened in between and behind the scenes of the documentary. But yeah, I guess my only thing would be, if you know you're doing something that's kind of challenges you and makes you a little bit nervous. At the time, it feels like it's not worth it, and that it's very stress inducing and it's full of a lot of anxiety. But at the end, you know, I felt really happy that I did it. And so a lot of us who are emerging public history professionals or emerging into the field of history, you know, it's okay to feel like you don't know what you're doing. Usually, you know, other people will help you out and you know, offer their knowledge or make things work for you. And at the end, even though you feel like, you know, I can't do this, you'll get to an end point, and what you end up with, it'll be worth it for the learning experience.
Thank you so much, Skylee, for chatting with me today. As I mentioned, we'll share some of the links and information to some of the things we shared and discussed. And again, if you haven't had a chance to see the documentary, please go check it out.